Halloween, fake football, ghosts and ghouls. I am ghostly Greg Sauce, Greg Smith, your host here at the Fake Football with the Week 8 starts and sits. And as always, we will start by recapping last week's picks. Quarterbacks are first. Starts were Phil Rivers, Blake Bortles, Brian Hoyer, Derek Carr, Zach Mettenberger. Pretty good week all around. Rivers, Hoyer, and Carr all finished in the top 10. Bortles didn't do great. QB 17 versus my ranking of QB 11 heading into Sunday's action. But he still scored 13 points, which from Blake Bortles, can you really be disappointed? I mean, the dude can't hit the broadside of the barn with a football. Scores 13 points. You got to take it. Mettenberger admittedly was a deep play only. I had him ranked at 17 among quarterbacks, and he didn't quite live up to the garbage time shenanigans that we would have expected playing against Atlanta. He finished his QB 22 with 7.5 points. On the sit side, Matt Stafford burned me a little bit. I had him pegged outside of the top 12 at QB 15. He finished his QB 11, scored almost 19 points. That's a solid day from Stafford. And it does seem like he did fall prey to his schedule in the earlier weeks a little more than maybe I was willing to admit. And this week he gets to face the soft Kansas City passing defense, but more on that later. Sam Bradford didn't cut the mustard. Joe Flacco overperformed my expectations against the Cardinals, but still, QB 15 outside of the top 12, no great shakes. Josh McCown and Colin Kaepernick were predictably bad in tough matchups. Let's move on to running backs. Frank Gore was fine, 7.5 points, RB 25. It's a little worse than I'd like to see from a guy who's considered an RB1, but you know what was really bad was this LeGarrette Blount call, and man, that game just really got away from him and the Patriots running game because they decided to straight stop running the ball. So that was a pretty awful pick, unfortunately. But, I think we made up for it with some of these other ones. Danny Woodhead, RB5 with 22 points. Chris Johnson, RB9 with 18 points. Rashad Jennings, RB58. You may be asking yourself, why is it Rashad Jennings colored in red like LeGarrette Blount and the other bad calls? Well, I'm going to say that the idea behind me picking Rashad Jennings here was good. I just had no idea that Orleans Darkwa was going to come out of nowhere to, vulture the bulk of the carries and the one rushing touchdown that the Giants scored. So, I'm going to pretend that this Rashad Jennings pick was a Rashad Jennings / the carries that should have gone to Rashad Jennings. Again, I always love to make excuses in these things, but I don't think it was a bad call. I think we identified an exploitable matchup. I just picked the wrong guy to do it because the guy who pulled it off was someone that no one expected to perform the way he did in that game. Duke Johnson was fine, RB24, 9 points. That's solid. On the sit side, Jonathan Stewart, kind of similar to the Stafford call. He actually moved up into my top 24 as the weekend approached. I think he was outside when I recorded the video last week, but he ended up at RB23 for me, which is probably still low for Jonathan Stewart, and he outperformed that, RB18 with 12.5 points. But the rest of these were all spot on. We kind of correctly assessed that Christine Michael and Joseph Randle would not, be able to coexist together in the Dallas backfield. I didn't expect Darren McFadden to go apeshit like he did, but I will take credit for these calls because you got to take credit for this stuff when you can in fantasy football. There's so much variance. Melvin Gordon, Joique Bell, Isaiah Crowell, all good calls. A little predictable in every case. I think if you had these guys, you weren't excited about starting any of them, especially with the news leading up to game day on Gordon. But in general, if you're still holding out hope for guys like this, you're probably not going to be paid off for holding out this long. Wide receivers. Dante Moncrief, I was expecting a pretty big game. He was fine. He was wide receiver 25 with 9.5 points. Martavis Bryant was good. Brandon Cooks, again, fine, but not great at wide receiver 30. Pierre Garçon was a little disappointing. And this ties into a call I made on the tight end side recommending against Jordan Reed based upon what the Buccaneers had done against tight ends in the past few games. So we just had a flip-flopped. We knew that, one side of that was going to produce, and I thought it was going to be Pierre Garçon. It turned out to be Jordan Reed, and I think that as long as Reed's healthy, he's probably an every week starter at tight end going forward. Michael Crabtree and Robert Woods were both good calls. Both finished inside the top 16 among wideouts. On the sit side, Tavon Austin, Mike Wallace, Kamar Aiken, Roddy White, Andre Johnson. just a bunch of garbage. All these guys didn't really do much. Ted Ginn Jr. actually did better than I thought he would. He finished as wide receiver 24 with 10.2 points against the staunch Eagles defense. And I think this kind of goes to show that, Carolina just doesn't have much in terms of receiving threats. And that does give Ginn some every week appeal, because who else is Cam Newton going to throw it to? It's basically Ginn and Jonathan Stewart out of the backfield and Greg Olsen, and that's it. So maybe recommending against Ginn as a starter or even like a top 30 play week to week isn't the smartest, but I did think the matchup dictated treading lightly and maybe staying away from Ginn. I like I said last week, I did use him in a league, and I got paid off for it, fortunately, but the takeaway here is that the Eagles defense is pretty good, and so that's something to keep in mind as you look at matchups going forward. Let's move on to tight ends. Always a crapshoot with tight ends, and the results reflect that. Delaney Walker, tight end 16 with 5.5 points. Charles Clay kind of busted out, tight end 24. I had him ranked 9th among tight ends. He only scored 2.6 points, but that's going to happen with these guys. You have to get used to that. There's a lot of variability week to week at the tight end position. Speaking of such, Eric Ebron, tight end 3 with almost 15 points. I had him ranked 13th, just barely startable. And I shouldn't say barely startable, because all tight ends are barely startable, but Ebron really outperformed what I expected in his first full game back, and I like him a lot going forward for the rest of the season. He does have a pretty tough matchup this week, so we'll get into that later. Kobe Fleener, who cares? Tight end 18, almost 5 points. Like, the real sad part about tight ends is that you look at all these guys that I'm recommending on both sides, and you can see this very slight difference between tight end 12, Zach Ertz over here with 6.3 points, and tight end 18, Kobe Fleener with 4.7 points. We're talking about less than 2 points difference between these guys, so it really is a dice roll. You have to get used to that. Larry Donnell, was one of the better calls here. He finishes tight end 28. I did have him ranked higher than that, so it wasn't the best prognostication by yours truly, but we'll deal with it. Crockett Gilmore was a little more usable than I expected. Tight end 17 with 5.3 points. I actually like him a lot going forward rest of the season. Not quite as much as a guy like Ebron or Jordan Reed, who we'll get to, or who we already got to. But getting back to Gilmore, kind of along the lines of Ted Ginn Jr., who else is Joe Flacco throwing to besides Steve Smith and Crockett Gilmore? Kamar Aiken is, a total boomer bust guy. Forset's going to get some work out of the backfield, but it's clear that the Ravens do like to throw the tight end, and I think that's going to benefit Gilmore, assuming he stays healthy. Jordan Reed, we'll wrap up with this. This was rough. He actually finishes the best tight end on the week with 19.2 points. I had him ranked 14, so again, I thought he'd be, borderline usable relative to the rest of the pack, but he really blew up in this game, and like I said, he's probably just an every week starter, assuming health. We'll move next, as usual, to the Game Phlebotic spreadsheet for Week 8. Let's start off with some of the starts and sits from this Miami-New England game. Through the magic of video editing, I was able to just check on the score at halftime, and LeGarrette Blount, who I tabbed as start here, has 34 yards. Danny Amendola is not doing much, one catch for 11 yards, and I will admit that part of me saying to start him here was relative to the Dion Lewis not being active news. And as it turns out, Dion Lewis is having a monster game right now as I speak. So good for him. But this Danny Amendola call is suffering because of that. On the sit side, Ryan Tannehill has looked awful in this game. That was probably going to be a good call. I mean, garbage time could save his day on the whole, but the thought process here was solid. Brandon LaFell has 22 yards receiving on 3 catches, 5 targets. He's actually getting targeted more in this game than I expected. And again, I anticipated more work for Amendola and less for LaFell. We all know that the Patriots vary their game plan from week to week, so who knows what's going to happen next week when they face the next team on the slate. But it's going to be hard to predict this wide receiver usage. I think for the most part, you're going to want to start Lewis and Gronk every week, and then occasionally, these other guys are going to chip in and give you some fantasy value. Before we move on, in case you're new to the Game Phlebotic spreadsheet, I just kind of want to run through what this is all about. It's basically just a summation of a lot of different factors that go into my thought process when I go to rank players and think about who I want to start, who I don't want to start for any given week. So I look at the injuries, I look at who's healthy, who's not. Again, As this was last updated on Wednesday, Dion Lewis was questionable for the game. We weren't sure if he was going to play. We're also looking at the Vegas lines here. New England was favored in this game by 8 points, and the over-under was 51. So that means that Vegas expects a total of 51 points to be scored in this game, or the equivalent of, say, a 30-21 game. And as you might imagine, 30-21, that's pretty high scoring. If you see high totals like this, that should mean that you're going to see offense in the game. And when you see offense, or when you see a high total like this coupled with a big point spread, with New England's as 8-point favorites, that means that New England is expected to score the bulk of those points. And so we got to factor that into our analysis, and that's why a guy like Ryan Tannehill was a sit in this game. Next up on the spreadsheet are these DVOA rankings, and DAVE, which is the same as DVOA except adjusted for preseason projections. These are Football Outsiders statistics, and what they're basically measuring is the value of certain team units. So there's total DVOA, just like as a team, which team's better. In this case, the Patriots are ranked as the best team in the league, first in both DVOA and DAVE. I'm just going to keep calling it Dave. It's so much easier to call it Dave. Whereas the Dolphins are kind of a mediocre middle-of-the-pack team, 14th or 15th, depending upon what you want to look at. But they also break it down by offense as a whole and defense as a whole, and then by phases of the game. So passing offense, passing defense, rushing defense. They even have stats for offensive and defensive line play, and that's what we're looking at here. And these are color-coded, so you can say, okay, if I see that Miami, the road team, has the 15th best passing offense in terms of DVOA here in orange, and I look at the defensive side of that, also in orange, this is for New England, they have the 11th best passing defense, we can infer things from this. That's a close enough match to where I wouldn't, put a whole lot of stock into one or the other. But looking below down at the rushing stats here, where Miami has the 4th best rushing offense according to DVOA, but the Patriots have the 21st worst rushing defense, that might lead you to believe that Lamar Miller is going to, have a big game. And that should mean that Lamar Miller has the opportunity to do that. But if we couple all of what we're learning here with this point spread where we see that New England is likely to be favored, scoring a lot of points, we can also interpret that to think that, okay, well, if Miami's playing from behind or playing catch-up most of the game, how much work is Lamar Miller really going to get? And so we can temper our expectations. Even though this is a nice matchup, rushing offense versus rushing defense-wise for Lamar Miller, in terms of game flow or game script, he's probably going to be at a disadvantage here. So that will probably bump him down the rankings overall for me. These Vegas numbers tend to weigh a little heavier than the matchups because a team like New England doesn't need to stop the run very well because their offense is so good. And that's baked into the spread, but it's not really baked into these DVOA numbers, especially when you're looking at individual units like a team's rushing defense or a team's passing defense. Anyway, all that said, let's get into actual starts and sits and the other matchups for Sunday and Monday. We'll go to Detroit and Kansas City. This is a London game very early in the morning on Sunday. And I have the wrong team name in here. I have Minnesota listed. That should be Kansas City, but Kansas City is 5.5-point favorites here. They're considered the home team, but this is really an away game for both teams. In terms of DVOA, there are a few matchups you can exploit in this contest. The first of which being passing offense for both teams. Neither team has a very good passing defense. Detroit ranks 31st in the league in DVOA. Kansas City ranks 24th, whereas both these teams are slightly better against the run. And particularly Kansas City is relatively solid. They are 13th in DVOA in rushing defense, and they're 9th best in defensive adjusted line yards for defensive line play when it comes to stopping the run. So this all boils down to a fairly good setup for passing, and we're going to see that with some of these picks that I've made. I'm going to start Matthew Stafford this week. I'm going to start Theo Riddick. I'm going to start Eric Ebron. I'm probably going to avoid Amir Abdullah, but I don't hate him if you're kind of desperate and he's one of the only running backs you have that's healthy or something. You could start him. I think he'll be okay, but he's outside of my top 24 at running back, and therefore I'm going to tab him as a sit here. I think that you might be able to do better depending upon what your other options are. One other thing to keep in mind about this game is that Jeremy Maclin was listed as questionable when I looked at the injuries early in the week. And, now it looks like he's going to play. I think he practiced today on Thursday. And so if he plays, that definitely bumps up, of course, his own stock, but also the stock of Alex Smith and generally the Chiefs offense as a whole. If Maclin plays, that opens things up for everybody. So keep that in mind. Watch his status leading up till Sunday. If he plays, then you can feel a little safer about starting a guy like Alex Smith as a QB streamer or in a 2-quarterback league. We're going to move on to Tampa Bay and Atlanta. Atlanta, pretty heavy favorites here, 7.5 points. The over-under is high, though, 48.5. So, again, we can look for some passing. We can look for some offense in general. It is worth noting, when we look at these Vegas lines, I also put what's called the VIG here. Tampa Bay is minus 115. And if it's a higher negative number, that means that more people have bet on that part of the line. So more people were betting on Tampa Bay in this game than Atlanta. Not a whole lot. It's just a slight shift, but that is something to keep in mind. So maybe in general, the betting public thinks that Tampa Bay is a little better than this spread indicates. And I'm somewhat inclined to agree. I think that Jameis Winston is starting to show some strides. I liked what I saw from him last week. He's starting to limit the turnovers a little bit more relative to early in the season. And he's going to be a start for me, kind of along the same lines as Zach Mettenberger last week. The Bucs are going to have to throw to keep up with Atlanta, and I think that bodes well for Jameis. And, of course, Mike Evans, who's an every-week starter. So, yeah, keep an eye on him. I think if you need a streaming play this week, Winston is a good option. And one other thing before we move on that I want to highlight with this matchup is the adjusted sack rate for the Falcons, 30th in the league. So Jameis is going to have time to throw. Just keep that in mind. Let's go next to Arizona and Cleveland. Arizona road favorites, 4.5 points, 46-point over-under. Action on Cleveland in the game, again, slight, but, not insignificant. What are we seeing in this matchup? Well, we know Arizona's good, so how are they going to attack Cleveland? How's Cleveland going to try to, combat a better team in this matchup? If we look at passing offense, Arizona's is very good. Cleveland's defense is decent against the pass. But then when we look at rushing, Arizona, pretty good, 12th in the league, but Cleveland is abysmal, 32nd in the league, and that's why you'll see Chris Johnson right over here as a start. 2 weeks in a row, I like CJ2K. On the flip side, I'm probably sitting Andre Ellington if I have him, and I don't have him anywhere. I was never really in on Ellington. But if you drafted him, I don't think this is a great matchup for him, if only because Chris Johnson, David Johnson should be able to move the ball pretty well, and when it comes to passing, I have a feeling that you're just going to see the standard, few targets to Ellington. He could break a big one, sure, but I don't think you want to bank on that. He's probably just a sit for me in general until his volume increases. I don't know if we'll ever see that happen with the way Chris Johnson has performed, but it's a situation to monitor every week, and this week Chris Johnson's a start, Andre Ellington's a sit. San Francisco and St. Louis are next. St. Louis, big favorites here in a matchup against the worst team in the NFL, according to DVOA, 32nd overall. The worst defense in terms of DVOA from the Niners, and a very, very bad offense from the Niners as well. 30th in DVOA, 28th in Dave. So what are the Niners going to be able to do in this game, if anything? I don't really know. St. Louis has the 7th best passing defense, the 4th best rushing defense. It's pretty ugly. I mean, there's really no easy way to attack that St. Louis D, and Colin Kaepernick has proven that in bad matchups, he is, someone you want to stay away from, and that's my recommendation this week. In fact, him and a lot of his teammates are on the sit side. Colin Kaepernick, Carlos Hyde, Torrey Smith, Vernon Davis. I don't know if I want to use any of those guys. I could see if you're desperate at tight end using Davis, and you might not have a better option than Hyde, but Hyde's injury scares me. We know that he's hurt now. We know that he has, a stress fracture in his foot, and we already have seen his workload limited because of that. And so I'm actually going to list Reggie Bush as a start. Now, I'm going to qualify this by saying it's probably only going to be worth it if you're playing in a PPR league, but Bush could have some sneaky value here as a guy who can catch, short dump-offs to relieve pressure on Kaepernick, and a guy who can spell Hyde if Hyde's injury flares up and forces him to the sideline. I do think that Bush, isn't a great play. He's probably going to be ranked outside of my top 30 at running backs. But with that said, if you're really looking for a flyer, if you play in a really deep league, I think Bush might be usable this week. And going forward, if this injury with Hyde continues to be a problem, Bush might be a guy who's worth rostering now just for, potential production in future weeks. Our next matchup is the New York Giants versus the New Orleans Saints. The Saints are favored by 3.5 here. Big total, 49 points. So get ready for some fireworks. I think I say that every week for at least one of these high over-unders, but I'm going to keep using it. Gotta, learn to use some different verbiage. It's so easy to get caught up in the same ones over and over again. Anyway, let's talk football. What do we expect here? Well, let's look first at some passing defense numbers. For the Saints, 30th in the league. Eli is going to be able to throw against this team. He's a start. On the flip side, adjusted sack rate, the Giants are last in the league. They have a really hard time pressuring the quarterback. We saw that against San Francisco with Colin Kaepernick, and Kaepernick had a pretty good game. What does that mean here? That means Drew Brees is also a start. If you have him, you're using him. You might see a quasi-vintage Brees performance in this game just because he'll have so much time to throw. I'm also going to say to start Larry Donnell. This is a deeper flyer at tight end. But again, he's a guy who's going to be ranked in that 12 to 17 range for me, which means if you want to roll the dice, baby, come on, Larry Donnell. The passing defense numbers for the Giants are, incorporated into me saying that Donnell is a start. You'll also notice that the Saints' rushing defense isn't any good either. They're 25th in the league in DVOA. Their adjusted line yards on D are 26th in the league. So you can run on the Saints. The problem here is the same thing we ran into last week with Rashad Jennings, is who do you choose out of the Giants' backfield as, the guy who you want to attack this Saints rushing defense? I don't know. I don't think you can pick Rashad Jennings. Shane Vereen is probably the safest, if only because he sees more work in the passing game, and there is supposed to be a fair amount of offense in this matchup. But Darkwa, Jennings, Andre Williams, I think it's just a stay away until we get a little bit more data on that backfield and their usage. I think last week, seeing how many carries and snaps Darkwa got is interesting. If we see that trend upward this week, then I think we can start to consider him in the following weeks as a start based on the matchup. But I'm not ready to do that yet. The Vikings and the Bears are next. Minnesota 1.5 point favorites. Pretty low total here, 42.5 points. I don't know if I agree with such a low total. I think that both these offenses are starting to come together a little bit. We're seeing some solid play from Jay Cutler. Teddy Bridgewater's looked a little bit better. I'm still not totally sold on him, but Stephon Diggs, who's a start this week, has, seemed to bring out some better aspects in Teddy. And, Chicago has the 26th ranked passing defense in the league. Their rushing defense is also very bad, so as if I needed to tell you to use Adrian Peterson this week. In fact, both these rushing defenses are fairly bad. Unfortunately, it's not super actionable for this type of presentation where we're talking about, fringe players who might become starters, because the two running backs in this game are not fringe players. Matt Forte and Adrian Peterson are elite running backs, and you're starting those guys basically every week. The one thing I will say about the Vikings and their defense is that because it is easier to run on them than to pass on them, we could see a heavier workload for Forte and maybe even Jeremy Langford spelling him, and less passing from the Bears in this matchup. I don't think you can sit Jay Cutler if he's the type of dude you want to play, like if you're in a 2-quarterback league, or Alshon Jeffrey. He's just a monster. I think you want him every week as well. But a guy like Eddie Royal is a guy I'm probably staying away from. I think when they pass, they'll probably use their primary targets, Jeffrey, Martellus Bennett, and Forte. So I'd sit Royal. But otherwise, I think everybody's going to be par for the course in this game. Mostly, solid to middling plays in the passing game. Let's move on to San Diego and Baltimore. Baltimore favored by 3 here at home, and a lot of action came in on them. That's worth noting. A little interesting, if only because the Baltimore offense has seemed so shambled, is that a word, for so long. And San Diego's offense has looked good, but the point spread is small, so I get it. People look at the San Diego defense, they say it's not good, because it isn't. It's 30th ranked in the league in DVOA, and they're really bad against the run, and they're pretty bad against the pass. Baltimore should be able to move the ball. And Baltimore's defense is not terrible. It's not great. One thing that I will note is that they are pretty good at getting to the passer, and that could bode poorly for Phillip Rivers in this game. I think you have to use Rivers if you got him, because still you can look at this 23rd ranked passing defense for Baltimore and think, well, Rivers, even if he's getting sacked, the rest of the time he'll probably be connecting with his receivers, and I buy that narrative. It's also worth noting that San Diego just can't run the ball, 30th ranked in the league in terms of rushing offense, whereas Baltimore is also good at stopping the run, 10th in the league. So Rivers is going to have to throw. I don't think you can let this adjusted sack rate number scare you off here. I think you kind of just want to be in on this game in general based on the high total. Offense should be all over the place on both sides of the ball. So Danny Woodhead, Stevie Johnson, Ladarius Green, Crockett Gilmore, I'm using all those guys. I mean, Green is more of a borderline case if Antonio Gates plays, but at this point it sounds like Gates is not going to play. And even if he does, Green should still get work. He has been getting work even when Gates has been healthy. On the sit side, sorry, Melvin Gordon, I think I'm just benching you until you show me something, dude. It's sad, but I think that this is an offense that works better through Danny Woodhead and the passing game. And until that changes, Melvin Gordon is not going to be a guy you can use. And I won't harp on this every week. I know I brought him up as a sit last week, but going forward, don't trust him until you see it first. That's what I'm going to say. Moving on, the Bengals and the Steelers. This is a pick right now. Steelers at home. So technically that means that the Bengals are considered the better team. And that's reflected in terms of, DVOA. The Bengals are the 4th best team in the league. The Pittsburgh Steelers are the 9th best team in the league. The Bengals have the best offense in the league according to DVOA. So you'd think they just make Cincy a 1-point favorite or something. It's rare to see a pick like this. The total's pretty high, 48. What do the rest of the numbers tell us here? Well, we've talked about Cincy's awesome offense. They're pretty good. Let's compare that to the Steelers' defense. The Steelers have been pretty poor against the pass, 22nd in the league. They've been a lot better against the run, 7th in the league. That might be a bit of a mirage, but I do think that they've played pretty well on that side of the ball in the limited, game film that I've watched. On the other side of the ball, Pittsburgh's offense, solid. 3rd best rushing offense in the league, thanks Le'Veon Bell. 8th best passing offense in the league. And, they might be better than that if Roethlisberger plays in this game. And the thought is that he's going to. So this 8th ranking for the Steelers passing offense, with Roethlisberger, maybe they're the 4th best team, the 3rd best team, the 2nd best team. Who knows? They have so many great receiving weapons. Martavis Bryant, Antonio Brown. We haven't seen this team at full strength for a few weeks, so we don't want to read too much into the DVOA rankings. What we do want to read into is this Vegas line and just generally what we've seen from this team when they've been healthy, dating back to last season. And when that happens, this offense is really good, and therefore I'm starting all the usual suspects, including Roethlisberger. Martavis Bryant is a start for me this week, and if Roethlisberger stays healthy through this contest, Bryant is going to be a guy who probably graduates away from the starts and sits, ranks into a guy you're just going to play every week. So watch out for that. Keep an eye on Roethlisberger leading up to game time, just in case, they scratch him at the last minute just to be safe. I could see them doing that, but I believe he'll play. And this is an important game. Cincinnati's already 6-0. They're in the same division. If Pittsburgh can get a win in this matchup, especially at home, that could bode well for their playoff chances. A loss would, make things a lot hairier. And with that in mind, I have a feeling Roethlisberger will play. The Titans and the Texans are next. There's no line on this game, or there wasn't when I checked last, mostly because we don't know if Mariota's going to play. So we're going to have to use our other tools to assess this game. And what do we see? Well, we see some bad offense. Whether you're talking about rushing or passing, neither of these teams have been very good on the offensive side of the ball. On defense, Houston hasn't been great either. They've been a very disappointing defense on the whole this year, and mostly in terms of how well they defend the pass. They're the 27th ranked team in passing defense DVOA. Even with their awesome defensive line, they're only 27th in the league in adjusted sack rate. It's like, where did J.J. Watt go? What's he doing? Can he help us? On the other side, they're 20th against the rush, so they're a little bit better at stopping the run, and that's something to keep in mind here, because if you had any thoughts about starting a Tennessee back, just don't. I mean, it's easier to pass on the Texans, and that Titans backfield is such a mess in the first place that I just don't think you want Antonio Andrews or Bishop Sankey, and when David Cobb comes back, that's going to make things even more complicated. I think Dexter McCluster is an interesting PPR play, but other than him, I would avoid the backfield basically at all costs. on the flip side, what's Houston going to do against the Tennessee defense? Well, Tennessee has actually been pretty good against the pass, 6th in the league, and terrible against the run, 30th in the league. That doesn't quite match up with their fantasy points allowed to running backs. The Titans have actually been pretty good at stopping opposing running backs from scoring fantasy points, but this DVOA number tells you that maybe that fantasy points against stat is a bit of a mirage, and so I don't think that Alfred Blue is a bad play here. He'll be ranked, in the probably 22 to 30 range for me this week, but I would avoid Chris Polk. Chris Polk seems to be the pass-catching back in this offense, and I think that the matchup here would dictate that Blue should get more work. Whether that happens, who the hell knows? Coaches, fly in spite of that sort of thing all the time and piss off fantasy owners like you and me. That's just how it works. But I wouldn't use Polk this week. I mean, in general, I'd probably avoid the Houston backfield too, just because it's so nebulous. We don't have any idea how it's going to shake out. But I think if you had to go one way or the other, if you lost Foster and you were able to pick up both the guys, I'd lean Alfred Blue this week over Polk. Getting back to passing, I do like Kendall Wright and Nate Washington in this matchup. Again, the passing defenses here are not very good, and these guys have performed well so far this season when they've played. And I mean, Wright, albeit on a limited number of targets, and he scored a fair amount of touchdowns, which may be a little misleading, but who else is catching the ball there? I mean, Delaney Walker is a decent option, but in terms of Titans pass-catching options, Kendall Wright is one of the better ones, and I think that you can use him here against a very poor Houston defense. And Nate Washington going against the Titans, we saw what he did last week. It seems like the number 2 receiver in that Houston offense is going to have value. Brian Hoyer somehow just keeps getting it done. I don't know if it'll continue, but for now I'm going to ride the train. I have Nate Washington up there too. These guys are both, top 30 receivers in my mind for this week. We get to our first afternoon game next, the Jets and the Oakland Raiders. The Jets are favored by 2.5 points on the road here. A total that's a little larger than I might have expected based upon the Jets defense, 44 points. Vegas is starting to give a little bit more respect to this Oakland team, and in particular their offense. And we can look at these DVOA numbers and we can see that they're a relatively respectable offense. 14th in DVOA, 15th in Dave. The problem is that they're facing the Jets defense, which is second best in the league. So Oakland plays this week, probably not all that great. I'm avoiding Derek Carr, Latavius Murray, and Michael Crabtree. I think Amari Cooper is probably just matchup proof at this point. I'd play him if I had him. With that said, he won't be like a top 15 receiver for me this week. But, top 25, top 20 is within the realm of possibility there. The Oakland defense has actually been decent, 17th versus the pass, 11th versus the rush. So I think we're going to see more quality play, or at least quality fantasy production from Ryan Fitzpatrick and Eric Decker. They're both starts for me this week. And I think Brandon Marshall's a no-brainer. If you have him, you're starting him. Next up, the Seahawks and the Cowboys. Seattle, 6.5 point favorites here on the road. Low total, 41 points. And that's the Matt Castle effect. Seattle's defense is good. Dallas's quarterback is bad. Seattle's heavy favorites. They should win handily, and Dallas might not score that many points. So that's what we're seeing here. How does that translate to fantasy? Well, I'm staying away from Des Bryant, even if he plays. I'm staying away from Jason Witten. Bryant is more due to the fact that I don't know if he's 100% yet, and it sounds like he's not. So I think there's a little too much risk in using him this week, especially against such a good defense. I wouldn't even be surprised if Bryant doesn't play at all, if they just scratch him leading up to game time and say, you know what, we don't want him to get beat up against this really tough Seattle secondary. We'll save him for the following week. Witten is another one that might seem counterintuitive because tight ends have scored a fair amount against the Seattle Seahawks this year, but this is just me betting against the Cowboys offense and Matt Castle in general. I don't think that Witten can have much value if the quarterback is just getting assaulted at all times. Why then am I recommending a start of Darren McFadden? Well, this is strictly volume, and it's also based upon some of the metrics we're going to see down here. Seattle's defense, 9th against the pass, 8th against the run. That's, not all that different. But I think if the Cowboys are going to have any shot in this game, McFadden is going to have to run a lot. They're going to have to, control the clock, keep Seattle's offense off the board, keep the game close. That's their chance of winning. And I do think that even if they do fall behind, we've seen that Darren McFadden is the new pass-catching Lance Dunbar-esque player in this offense. And if that happens, he could still have some value even in a garbage time situation. If the game gets really out of hand, we might see some extra work from Christian Michael. But in general, McFadden is the only Cowboys player I'd be even considering using this week. And I think he's actually a decent play. Sunday Night Football is next. The Packers and the Broncos. 2 undefeated teams enter. Only one leaves. Pending a tie, of course. You never know. Green Bay 3-point favorites here on the road. And that just seems like disrespect. I could see the Broncos coming out and playing with a bit of a chip on their shoulder in this game, keeping the game a little closer, maybe showing a little more on offense. With that said, that's a total narrative, and I really do think that this is a game that the Packers should win, especially when you look at some of the DVOA rankings. The aforementioned Broncos offense is the worst in the league, the worst, and the Packers defense is pretty good, 7th in the league. They're good against the pass, especially. Not quite as good against the run. They were horrible against the run early in the year, but they've ramped that up. They've gotten up to 17th in DVOA rushing defense, the Packers have. I mean, what is Denver going to do in this game if Green Bay jumps out to a 14-point lead or a 14-3 lead? Denver's going to have to throw to keep up, and this Green Bay passing defense is solid. And we haven't seen enough from Peyton Manning to prove that he can beat good defenses or even bad defenses. So, he's a sit. And I don't think you can sit Demaryius Thomas or Emmanuel Sanders. And that might seem, I don't know. I'm definitely hedging there, but I don't know. I worry about the Broncos in this game, particularly Manning. And their running game should be where they go. And I think the case for Denver hanging in and possibly winning this game lies on the back of their defense playing amazingly and just dealing with Aaron Rodgers and dealing with the Packers, which is possible, don't get me wrong. And then them leaning on the run on offense, leaning on Hillman and CJ Anderson. I think that Hillman is the safer play, if only because if the Broncos do fall behind and have to throw a little bit more, you want the pass catching back. You don't want CJ Anderson. Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting matchup. I had a hard time wrapping my brain around this. I'm not going to recommend starting anyone in particular just because I don't have a great feel for how this game's going to play out. I think that, a few key plays will probably dictate the pace of, who needs to play in what style early in the game. But on the sit side, I'd stay away from Manning. I'd stay away from James Starks. I know that this is probably obvious at this point because now we're hearing that he's injured and Lacey's healthy. But if you picked up James Starks, a week ago thinking, oh yeah, this guy is the real deal, he's going to replace Lacey, become the new feature back, I don't believe that at all. And, the injury news leading up to today when I'm recording this also indicates that, Starks probably won't be very usable in this game. And if anything, Lacey is the guy you want. And I'm not even sure you want him against the Broncos defense, which is, 6th in the league at stopping the run. I'm also saying to sit James Jones and Richard Rodgers. I could see one of them performing well. I just don't see it from both of them. And because I have a feeling one of them is going to get, smothered in this game, I'm just going to discourage playing either one because you don't want to end up with that goose egg or that, 2-point week from a wide receiver like Jones. The Denver defense is the best in the league at stopping the pass. They have awesome cornerbacks, and James Jones has never been a guy who's really been good at getting separation. And with that in mind, him and Rodgers, big guys, but slower guys. I have a feeling that the Denver defense is going to be able to deal with those guys to some extent. Last up on the docket, Monday Night Football, the Colts and the Panthers. Panthers at home, 6-0, heavy favorites against, a very disappointing Indianapolis team, 7-point favorites. With that said, at this line of 7 points, when I looked at it last, most of the action had come in on the Colts. They're minus 120 on the VIG, so maybe this game will be a little closer than it seems, and I could buy that. The Carolina defense is good, but Indy's offense isn't terrible. The one thing we really don't know is how hurt is Andrew Luck, and it seems like he's dinged up. You can't trust him, and I'm actually going to recommend sitting him this week. It might seem blasphemous, but I think that there are going to be at least 12 quarterbacks that finish better than Luck this week. I do think, Luck should have better games, but this is such a tough matchup. The Carolina defense is second in the league against the pass. It's much easier to run the ball on them. They're only 22nd in the league at stopping the run. And that means the Colts will be incentivized to run it a little bit. I think that Frank Gore is a sneaky, decent play in this game, because it's not like the Panthers score quickly and often. They're not that type of team. They beat you with defense. They beat you with pounding the ball on the ground with Stewart and Cam Newton. And quick, easy plays. The occasional big play, sure. Ted Ginn maybe gets open down the sideline, so on and so forth. I can see that. But in general, they're not the type of team who's going to come out and, punch you in the mouth and go up 21-3. So with that in mind, I think that Indy will have time to try to establish the run in this matchup. I think you can look for that to happen. On the other side, Jonathan Stewart should be doing the same thing for Carolina. This is a really nice matchup for him. The Colts are 15th in the league at stopping the run, but in general, running is what the Panthers want to do. And we've seen Stewart perform well against a couple of solid defenses the past 2 weeks. Here against a more mediocre rushing defense, this is a good spot to use him if you were able to weather the early storm of disappointing weeks from Jay Stu. Also on the sit side, Fleener and Allen, the tight ends for Indianapolis. What can I say? The usage is just so unpredictable, and they eat into each other's play. The wide receivers, they eat into their targets. It's just not a good situation. Carolina has performed very well against tight ends in terms of fantasy points allowed. So this is not a matchup I'm looking to deploy either of these guys because of the volatile, nature of the position and the fact that there are so many quote-unquote usable tight ends, guys who could score a touchdown essentially. I don't know if Fleener and Allen are guys you want to even try to use this week when the matchup is so brutal. And that wraps things up here at the Fake Football with the Week 8 starts and sits. Once again, I've been your host, Greg Smith, at Greg Sauce on Twitter. Be sure to follow me. You can follow at the Fake Football as well to get updates on all of our different articles and strategy. Have a safe Halloween. Don't eat too much candy. We'll catch you next time. Adios.